Version of the to-do list. We'll go back to supersimple.dev, and then here we'll scroll down and we'll create this final version. So in this version, we can type a to-do like make dinner, and we can also add a due date. And when we click add, each to-do will now have a name and a due date. And they will also have a delete button that we can click to remove it from the list. So let's build this out one feature at a time. We'll start by creating this delete button. We'll go into our code, and remember, we're generating the HTML for the to-do list. So for each value in the array, we create a paragraph element. So to add a delete button, we just have to add a delete button inside here. So inside the paragraph, we'll create a less than, button, greater than, and then less than / button greater than. And then inside this button, we'll put the text delete. Let's save. And in the console, you'll see that the HTML we generated now has a delete button inside the paragraph. And that's what shows up on the page. Next, we're going to reformat this HTML to make it a little easier to read. So we'll create some new lines here and at the end. And let's put the content of the paragraph on its own line, like this. And also put the delete button on its own line. So remember that template strings have a feature called multi-line strings. So this is perfect for writing HTML code.
Hey developers, join us for the biggest AI competition with over $10,000 in cash prizes. Yep.
The last step in the process is to make the website interactive. So next, let's make our delete button do something when we click it. To do that, we use the onClick attribute as usual. Next, inside, you'll greater than, and and then less than slash button delete version. And then we'll go back to supersimple.dev. And then here, we'll scroll down and we'll create this final version. Now let's create the final version of the to-do list. We'll go back to supersimple.dev, and then here, we'll scroll down and we'll create this final version. So in this version, we can type a to-do like make dinner, and we can also add a due date. And when we click add, each to-do will now have a name and a due date. And they will also have a delete button that we can click to remove it from the list. So let's build this out one feature at a time. We'll start by creating this delete button. We'll go into our code, and remember, we're generating the HTML for the to-do list. So for each value in the array, we create a paragraph element. So to add a delete button, we just have to add a delete button inside here. So inside the paragraph, we'll create a less than button greater than, and then less than slash button greater than. And then inside this button, we'll put the text delete. Let's save. And in the console, you'll see that the HTML we generated now has a delete button inside the paragraph. And that's what shows up on the page. Next, we're going to reformat this HTML to make it a little easier to read. So we'll create some new lines here and at the end. And let's put the content of the paragraph on its own line, like this. And also put the delete button on its own line. So remember that template strings have a feature called multi-line strings. So this is perfect for writing HTML code. The last step in the process is to make the website interactive. So next, let's make our delete button do something when we click it. To do that, we use the onClick attribute as usual. So inside this button, we're going to add an onClick attribute equals double quotes. And then inside these double quotes, we can run some JavaScript when we click this button. So this works the exact same way as what we've been doing so far in this course. The only difference now is that here, we're generating this HTML using JavaScript. Okay, so when we click one of these delete buttons, we want to remove this to-do from the list. Earlier in this lesson, we learned how to remove a value from an array using a method called splice. So inside this onClick attribute, we're going to type the to-do list dot splice and brackets. So splice takes two numbers. The first number is the index that we want to remove. So if we click this delete button, how do we know which index to remove? Well, if we look at our loop up here, we already have the index. It's this variable I. So we're going to insert I into this string. And we can do that by typing dollar, curly brackets, and I. Now splice also takes another number. So we'll type comma, and the second number is how many values we want to remove. So here, we just want to remove one value at this index. And finally, because we updated the to-do list, we need to display the list again on the page. To display the list, we can use this function, render to-do list. So down here, we're going to type render to-do list and brackets. Now, if we save, you can see that in the generated HTML, when we click the first delete button, it will remove the value at index 0, which is the first value. If we click the second button, it will remove the value at index 1, which is the second value. So we're basically generating all this HTML using a loop. So now if we click this delete button, it will remove it from the list and then display the updated list on the page. So that's how we create the delete button.
Bro, if you keep learning Python like this.
Next, let's go back to supersimple.dev, and we're going to create the due date feature. So first, let's create this date selector in our HTML. We'll go to our HTML file, and then under the text box, we're going to add another input element. So less than, input, greater than. And to make it a date selector, input elements have an attribute called type. So this attribute determines what kind of input it is. If the type is text, which is the default value, it's going to be a text box. Now, if we change the type to date and save, it's going to create a date selector. Now let's go back into our JavaScript code. And first, we're going to scroll up. And remember that right now, our to-do list is just an array of strings. But this time, each to-do is also going to have a due date. So how do we group the name and the due date together? We can do that using an object. So here, instead of just a string, we're going to create an object. And we'll give it a name property, which is make dinner, and we'll give it a due date property. And we'll make the due date a string. So you can type whatever date you have on the page. For me, it's 2022-12-22. And I'll end this object with a curly bracket, and I'll turn the second to do into an object as well. So open curly bracket, name, and due date. 2022-12-22, and closed curly bracket. Now that each to do is an object, we need to update the rest of our code. Let's scroll down, and we'll start with the render function. So here, inside the loop, each to do is no longer just a string, it's an object. So let's change this variable name to to-do object to make it more clear. And now we need to get the name and due date out of this object. So we'll type const name equals to-do object dot name, and const due date equals to-do object dot due date. And now instead of inserting to do, which no longer exists, we're going to insert the name. And we're also going to insert the due date. If we save, now each to-do will also display a due date. Before we continue, we're going to review a shortcut we can use with objects called destructuring. So here, you'll notice the variable name is the same as the property name. We actually have a shortcut for this using const, curly brackets, name equals to-do object. So this is called destructuring. This takes the name property out of the object and puts it in a variable also called name. And this is a shortcut for this line up here. So we can comment out this line. We can also use multiple properties in this shortcut. To also take the due date out of the object, we can just add a comma and due date. So this will do the same thing as this line of code. And we can comment this out. If we save, everything still works. Next, let's scroll down, and we're going to update our add to do function. So this time, when we click the add button, we're going to get the name and the due date and put it into our list. So let's get the due date out of this date selector first. We can do that using the DOM like we did here. So let's add a class attribute so we can get it using query selector, js-do-date-input. And then down here, let's create a variable const date input element and make it equal to document.query selector and a string dot, and then the class we want to select, which is this class, js-do-date-input. So this will get the date selector element and put it into our JavaScript. And now below this, let's get the due date out of the element. We can do that using the value property again. So let's create a variable first, const due date, and we'll make it equal to the date input element dot value. So this will get the date that we selected and save it in this variable. And now when we add a to-do to our list, instead of just a name, we're going to add an object. So open curly bracket, we'll add a name property, and the value will be the name variable up here. So name, and then comma, and a due date property. And the value will be this due date variable up here. So due date, and then a closed curly bracket. And remember that objects also have a shortcut for this. If the property and the variable name are the same, we can just type it out once, like this. This will do the same thing as this line above. Same thing with the second line. If the property and the variable name are the same, we can just type a comma and type it out once. This is called the shorthand property syntax. So these two lines do the same thing as these lines above. So we can comment this out using // and //. So that's all the code that we needed to update. Now let's save our JavaScript file, and we'll also save our HTML file. And let's go to our project. We'll add a new to-do like watch YouTube and select a date and click add and scroll down. You can see that it added our new to-do with a name, due date, and a delete button. If we click this delete button, it will remove that to-do. If we click this one, it will also remove the correct to-do. And that's actually all the functionality that we need for this project. So let's go into our code, and we're going to clean up by removing the console.log here and the console.log up here. And save. Finally, let's add CSS to our project to make it look like the final design. We'll go into our code editor and scroll to the top. And instead of writing all the CSS in here, let's put the CSS in a separate file, just like our JavaScript. So we'll click here to show our files, and then find the styles folder. And we'll click the styles folder and click this icon to create a new file inside. And we'll name this file 11-to-do-list.css and press enter. And for the video, I'm going to take this CSS file and put it at the bottom of my code editor so I can see these files side by side. And now I'll click here to close it, and we'll load this CSS into our HTML. To do that, we can use a link element. So inside the head section, let's type less than link greater than, and we're going to give it two attributes. Rel equals style sheet, and href equals the file that we want to load. So we created this in the styles folder. So we'll type styles and then a slash to go into the folder, and we'll load this file 11-to-do-list.css and save. Now let's style our project one by one until it matches the final design. We'll start with the text on the page. We're going to change the font. So in here, let's type body, curly brackets, and then we'll change the font dash family colon Arial and save. So that looks pretty good. Now let's work on styling the to-do list. First, let's add some more to-dos to the list. So we'll type watch YouTube, and then we'll select the date and click add. And we're going to learn how to style our list to look like this. So notice that this list creates a sort of grid. We're going to create this grid using a feature called CSS grid. So let's go into our and we'll select a date.
I graduated. आयुष शर्मा में graduated.
HTML first. We're going to add a class to this div element so we can style it. To do dash grid. And let's save. And inside our CSS, we're going to style this class using dot to do dash grid and curly brackets. And to turn this into a grid, we're going to use the property display and grid. And we're going to add another property called grid dash template dash columns. So this basically sets how many columns are in our grid. The number of values that we give it is the number of columns. For example, if we give it 200 pixels, 150 pixels, and 100 pixels, this will create 3 columns in the grid. The first column will be 200 pixels, the second column will be 150 pixels, and the third column will be 100 pixels. And now each element inside this div will go into the columns. So the first element will go in the first column, second element will go in the second column, and the third element will go in the third column. If we have more than 3 elements, it will wrap around and create a new row.
Are you looking to start your own business? Well, look no further than busy.com. Right now, we'll complete your LLC filing.
So let's save. And unfortunately, that didn't quite work. And that's because if we go back to our JavaScript, remember that each to-do is one paragraph element. So this entire to-do with the name, due date, and delete button will go inside the first column. And then the next entire to-do will go inside the second column. But what we actually want is for the name to go in column 1, due date column 2, and delete button column 3. To do this, we're going to separate this element into 3 elements so that each element will go into each column. So instead of one paragraph, let's actually use a div element. So less than, div greater than, and less than slash div greater than. And in between, we'll insert the name. So the reason we use a div element is because div elements don't have any default styling. So it's a little easier to style with CSS. For the due date, let's also create a div element. So less than div, and then at the end, less than slash div greater than. And finally, for the delete button, we already have an element. So let's just reformat these lines. We'll select these lines and then press Shift Tab to remove the indent. Let's remove the extra line. And we basically separated each to-do into 3 elements. If we save, now the grid is working because this element goes into the first column, this element goes into the second column, and the button goes into the third column. And that's how we lay out these elements in a grid, like the final design. Next, let's also lay out the inputs and the add button in a grid. We'll go to our HTML, and let's put these 3 elements in a div so we can use grid. So we'll create a less than, div greater than, and then inside, let's remove this, and we'll add it at the end, less than slash div, and let's reformat these lines by selecting them, and then press Tab to add an indent. And now let's make this div a grid as well. Let's go back to our CSS, and we'll add a class to this div. Class equals, let's call it to-do dash input dash grid. And instead of writing all the CSS again, we can use a feature of CSS. So here, we're going to type a comma and enter. So when we type a comma, we can style multiple classes at the same time. So we're also going to style dot to-do dash input dash grid. If we save the CSS file, and let's also save the HTML file, now the input and the add button are also laid out in the same grid. Next, let's adjust the spacing inside our grid. So grid has some properties for this. We'll go to our CSS, press enter, and we'll use the property column dash gap. So this sets the spacing between the columns of the grid. So let's make this colon 10 pixels and save. So now it will add 10 pixels between each column. Let's add some spacing between the rows as well. And grid has another property for this. Row dash gap colon 10 pixels and save. So that will add 10 pixels of space between the rows. Now notice it didn't add space between these 2 rows, and that's because these 2 are separate grids. This is the to-do list, and this is the to-do input grid. So to add space between them, we're just going to use margin. At the bottom, we'll style dot to-do dash input dash grid, and we'll just add some margin under this grid. So margin dash bottom colon 10 pixels and save. All right, now let's move on to styling the inputs and the buttons. We'll start with the inputs first. Let's add a class so we can style them. Here, let's add a class name dash input, and down here, let's also add another class, due dash date dash input. Let's save. And now inside our CSS, we'll style both of these inputs. So we'll style dot name dash input, curly brackets, and first, let's make the text bigger, like the final design. We'll set the font dash size colon 15 pixels and save. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now let's add spacing on the inside of this input. So we'll add padding 6 pixels and save. And that looks pretty good. Let's move on to the due date input. So we actually want the same styles as the name input. So again, we can use that feature of CSS. We'll type a comma and then dot due dash date dash input. So now these styles will be applied to this class and to this class. Let's save. And that looks pretty good to me. Let's move on and style the buttons. We'll go into our HTML and find the add button. Let's add a class so we can style it. And we'll use add dash to do dash button. Let's save. And then inside our CSS, we'll style that class using dot add dash to do dash button, curly brackets. And let's start with the background color. We'll set the background dash color colon green and save. Now let's do the text color colon white and save. Now let's remove the border around our button using border colon none, save. And let's make the text a little bigger. So we'll do font dash size colon 15 pixels and save. And the last thing we'll add is when we put our mouse over the button, it turns into this pointer icon. We can do that using cursor colon pointer and save. Next, let's style the delete buttons. So these delete buttons are created in our JavaScript. We'll go into our JavaScript file, and then here, let's add a class to each of the delete buttons so we can style them. So we'll add class equals double quotes, and then delete dash to do dash button. Let's save. And then inside our CSS, at the bottom, we'll style dot delete dash to do dash button, curly brackets. And let's start with the background color. So we'll set background dash color colon, and for this design, I use the color dark red and save. So that will style our delete buttons. Now let's change the text color to white. So we'll use color colon white and save. Now let's remove the border using border colon none, save. And let's also make the text bigger using font dash size colon 15 pixels, save. Let's add this pointer icon using cursor colon pointer, save. And let's add some padding at the top and bottom of the button. So we'll add padding dash top colon 10 pixels and padding dash bottom colon 10 pixels and save. So that's all the styles we need for the delete button. And we can also close the console to see the entire list. However, now we have another problem, which is this text and this button are not vertically aligned in the center. To vertically align in the center, we're going to go back to the grid styles. So
एक प्रॉपर्टी होती है बेसलाइन करके क्या होता है वो
scroll up to the to-do grid, and CSS grid has another property for vertical alignment, and that is align dash items colon center, to vertically align in the center. If we save, now the text is aligned with the button, but now we have a new problem. Our add button is no longer stretching to be the same as the inputs. So by default, align items is stretch. That's why this button stretches to match the inputs. And now that we changed it to align center, it's no longer going to stretch. So to solve this problem, we just have to make this grid stretch. So down here in the to-do input grid styles, we'll change align dash items back to stretch and save. And that will cause this grid at the top to stretch vertically again. And that's it. That's all the styling that we need. And now we finished this to-do list project. In the rest of this lesson, we're going to learn more details about arrays and loops. So I'm going to put this back in the same window, and I'll rearrange this window. And now let's go back to 11 arrays and loops.html, and we'll open the tab for that file. And we can also close these other files for now. And first, let's comment out the previous code using /* and at the bottom, */. And we'll scroll down and save. The first detail we're going to learn is that arrays are references. So in the object lesson, we learned that objects are references. Arrays work the same way. So for example, if we create an array const array1 equals the array 1, 2, 3, this variable doesn't actually contain the values 1, 2, 3. This array is saved somewhere in the computer's memory, and this variable only contains a reference that points to where this array is in memory. And that means if we create a copy of this variable, const array2 equals array1, array2 doesn't contain a copy of the values. It actually just contains a copy of the reference. So now both of these variables are pointing to the same array. So if we did array2.push 4, and then we console.log array1, and we console.log array2, and save, it will show us that even though we added 4 to array2, array1 and 2 were both modified. And that's because arrays are references. So both of these point to the same array in memory. To avoid this behavior, we can create a copy of the values in the array using a method called slice. So here, if we did array1.slice instead, this will make a copy of the values in array1. And now these two variables point to two different arrays. If we save, Now you'll see that this line only affected array 2. The second detail we're going to learn is a shortcut called destructuring. So at the bottom here, let's create a new array, const array 3 equals the array 1, 2, 3. And let's say we want to get the first value and the second value out of this array. One way to do this is to use the index like this. Another way is to use a shortcut called destructuring. So here, we're going to replace this with square brackets. And now we can type some variable names. If we type first value, it will take the first value and save it in a variable called first value. If we type comma and second value, it will take the second value and save it in this variable. So this is an easier way to get values out of an array and save them inside a variable. Next, we're going to learn more details about loops. So loops have two features called break and continue. Break lets us exit a loop early. For example, let's create some new lines, and let's create a loop that counts from 1 to 10. So as usual, we can use a for loop. Let I equals 1, I less than or equal to 10, and I plus plus. And we'll console.log I and save. So this will count from 1 to 10. So now let's say that when I is 8, we want to stop this loop early. So first, let's check if I is equal to 8. If it is equal to 8, we're going to stop this loop by typing break and semicolon. If we save, once this reaches 8, break will cause this loop to stop, and now it only counts up to 8. So that's the break feature of a loop. It lets us stop a loop early. The next feature is called continue. Continue lets us skip one iteration of the loop, or one run of the loop. For example, let's say we want to skip the number 3. So at the top, we can check if I is equal to 3, and if it is, we can use the code continue. This will skip the rest of this code and go back up to the top of the loop and do I equals 4. If we save, this will skip 3 in the loop. So continue lets us skip one iteration of the loop. So now let's say that we want to skip a number if it's divisible by 3. Divisible by 3 means the number can be divided evenly into 3. For example, 3 and 6 are both divisible by 3, but 7 is not divisible by 3 because there's one remaining. This is called the remainder, and we can calculate the remainder using the remainder operator, which looks like this. So to check if a number is divisible by 3, we can check if the remainder is 0. So here, we're going to replace this with I remainder 3, and we'll check if the remainder is equal to 0. If we save, this will skip 3 and 6 because they're both divisible by 3. Next, let's use continue in a while loop. So at the end here, we'll create some new lines, and let's say we want to count from 1 to 10 using a while loop. So we'll create a loop variable, let I equals 1, and we'll create a while loop, I less than or equal to 10, curly brackets, and the increment step, I plus plus. And inside the loop, we'll just console.log I and save. So this will count from 1 to 10 again. And let's say we want to not count numbers that are divisible by 3. So 3, 6, and 9. So at the top here, we can check if I remainder 3 is equal to 0 and curly brackets. And we might just try to do continue. However, in a while loop, continue will actually skip the increment step, and this will cause an infinite loop. So when using continue in a while loop, we have to do this increment step manually. So before continue, we have to do I plus plus to avoid an infinite loop. If we save, it will skip the numbers that are divisible by 3, which is 3, 6, and 9. So remember, in a while loop, if we use continue, always do the increment step manually. In a for loop, however, the increment step is done automatically after every iteration. All right, the last detail we're going to learn is how to use loops with functions. So let's say we have an array of numbers, and we want to create a copy of this array where each number is doubled. So we already have the code for this. We can scroll up, and the code for this is here. So let's actually make a copy of this code from before. We'll right-click, copy, and scroll down here. And at the bottom, right-click and paste. At the top, let's create an array called nums. So const nums equals array and 1, 1, and 3. If we save, this will create an array where each number is doubled. Now, what if we wanted to use this loop on a different array? Other than 1, 1, and 3. We can do that using a function. So let's create a function around this loop. We'll create function, let's name it double array, brackets, and curly bracket. We'll remove the closed curly bracket, and at the bottom, we'll add it back. And we'll select these lines and press tab. So now, instead of doing this loop on the same array every time, we can turn this into a parameter. So at the top here, we'll create a parameter called nums. And we're going to delete this line, and we're going to loop over this parameter instead. So at the bottom, we can call our function using double array and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to save an array into nums. So square bracket 1, 1, and 3. If we save, this will do the same thing as before. But now because it's in a function, we can use this loop with any array, not just 1, 1, and 3. So at the end, we can do double array brackets and an array 2, 2, 5 this time, and save. And it will create an array where these numbers are doubled. So using a function, we can reuse this loop for any value. Another feature of using a function with a loop is that we can break out of this loop using a return instead. So first, let's actually use a return in this function. Instead of console.log, we're going to return nums doubled. And here, we're going to console.log the result. Console.log and console.log. And save. So this does the same thing as before, except we're returning the result and console.logging outside of the function. Now let's say that if we see the number 0, we want to stop this loop early. To do that, we can click here and check if num is equal to 0. And if it is, we can break out of this loop. Now, when we're inside a function, we can also use a return statement to break out of this loop. So we can also do return nums doubled. So a return statement will end this function immediately. So this is another way of ending the loop. So down here, if we add the number 0 and then 5 and save, you'll notice that the loop stops when we see the number 0. So return is another way of breaking out of a loop when it's inside a function. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, so return is another way of breaking out of a loop when it's inside a function. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned about arrays, which represent a list of values. We learned about loops, which let us run some code over and over, just like a loop. We learned a technique we can use with loops called the accumulator pattern, and we used it to create a to-do list project. We learned that arrays are references and the destructuring shortcut, and we learned more features of loops, like break, continue, and using loops inside a function.
Managing your clients and sales is easy when you're just starting out. But as your business grows and so does your team,
Here are some exercises to help you practice arrays and loops. To-do list project. First, let's create a new file for this lesson. We'll go to our code editor and click up here to show our files. We're going to click this icon and into this file. So we'll click on 10 DOM projects and we'll type here and type Control A or Command A to select the code, and then right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste. Now let's hide our files and we'll prepare this file for this lesson. So we can scroll to the top and we'll change the title to arrays and loops, and let's remove all of the CSS. And we'll also remove the HTML, which is right here. And we'll remove all the JavaScript. Now let's save, and we'll open this file in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. And let's also open the console. So we'll right-click, click inspect, and click the console. And now we can close the previous tabs and the previous code for now, until we just have the lesson 11 file. Now we're ready to learn arrays. An array is another type of value in JavaScript, and it represents
Hmm. अरे यार क्या कर रही हो? अभी जल रही होगी क्योंकि मैं खाना निकालने गया था ना। बंद कर दो, गलती हो होगा, भूल गया। मेरे टाइम पे तुम कैसे भूल गए? मैं भूलना, तुम भूली नहीं थी। क्या? अरे यार ये क्या हो रहा है? बाप के काम करते हैं ना, पढ़ने वाला काम मैं खुद ही कर लेता हूँ। मेरे से अभी फिलहाल नहीं करना है, उसके बाद में
a
कर
list of
लूँगा।
other values. So let's do an example and create our first array. We'll go into the script element and we'll out is a built-in
इन दी एंड ये पूरी लिस्ट तो मैं पढ़ने के बाद ही बना ही लूँगा, मतलब जब सब कर लेंगे तो।
I've been using Grammarly for 3 years, and I can't imagine my work life without it. Grammarly is an AI writing partner, and unlike other AI tools, Grammarly works where you work. Writing suggestions,
function. So we can type brackets to call this function. Now, in this lesson, we're going to learn some advanced features of functions, and we're going to use them to improve our previous products. First, let's create a new file for this lesson. We'll go to our code editor and click here to show our files, and click here to create.
क्यों बंद कर दिया बाय द वे? वो एकदम से कम फास्ट पे करूँगा, अच्छा तो है। वो ठंडा लग रहा है मुझे यार, तो कंबल ओढ़।
अपना काम तो तुम सर चढ़ के सवार होकर करते हो जो इतने गंदे तरीके से।
अच्छा ये बात,
और दूसरे का काम होता है ना तो तुम किस तरीके से करते हो? सुनो सुनो मत बोलो, जाओ यहाँ से।
मुझे गर्मी लग रही है तो मेरे पे ठंडा लगने का और कोई ऑप्शन ही नहीं है, बट तुम्हें अगर ठंडा लग रहा है तो तुम ज्यादा कपड़े पहन के ठंडा कम कर सकती हो।
Create a new file, and we'll name this 12-advanced-functions.html and press enter.
पानी लेके आना।
Let's copy 11 arrays and loops into this file. So we'll click here, Control A or Command A, and then right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste. And we can close this for now, and let's prepare this file for this lesson. So we'll scroll up, and change the title to advanced functions. And let's remove all the JavaScript code from before. And now let's save and open this file in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. And let's also open the console on this page. So we'll right-click, inspect, and open the console. And now we can close the previous tabs, as well as the previous files. And now we're ready to begin. So first, we're going to review how to use functions. Inside the script element, let's create a function using the word function. We'll give it a name, greeting, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside the function, we'll type the code console.log, the string hello. So this is a function, and it lets us reuse code. To run the code inside this function, we can type the function name, which is greeting, and then brackets.
क्या क्या
If we save, this line of code will run the code inside the function and display hello. This is known as calling the function or running the function. So now that we understand functions, we're going to learn an advanced feature of functions, which is functions are values. So we learned many types of values in this course, like numbers, strings, and booleans. And we can save a value in a variable. For example, let's create some new lines, and we'll create a variable const num equal 2. So this will save the value 2 inside the variable num. Now functions are also values, and this means just like a number, we can save a function inside a variable. So let's give it a try. We'll create a new line and type const function 1, and we'll make this equal to a function this time. So we'll just type function and a name, greeting, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside the function, we'll type console.log, the string hello 2. And we'll put a semicolon at the end since we're saving in a variable. So this variable now contains a function. We're using the exact same syntax as before, except we're just taking this function and saving it in a variable because functions are values. So now that this function is inside this variable, let's actually console.log it. So we'll console.log function 1 and save. And this will show us that the variable function 1 actually contains this function. Now on a new line, we can also do console.log and check the type of function 1 and save. And it will tell us that the type of this variable is a function. So as you can see, a function is just another type of value, and we can save it in a variable. We can also run the function inside this variable by typing the variable name function 1, and because this contains a function, we can actually just call it using brackets. So this will run the code inside this function. If we save, it displays hello 2. Now let's do some cleanup in this code. In JavaScript, as long as there's a way to access a function, this function name is not needed. So here, we can access this function using this variable. So this function name is not needed, and we can actually just delete it like this. And now this is called an anonymous function, which means a function without a name. Now, an interesting thing to know is that the function syntax that we've been using this entire course up here is actually a shortcut for this code. Now, even though this syntax uses var, and we usually don't recommend var, this syntax actually has a couple advantages. Number one, it's easier to read, and number two, it gives us a feature called hoisting, which means we can call this function, greeting brackets, before we create it in the code. So using hoisting, we don't have to worry about what order we write this code. Hoisting doesn't work when we create our function and save it in a variable like this. So in JavaScript, functions are values, and just like any other value, we can save it in a variable. Now let's think, what else can we do with a value? Well, we can save a value in an object. For example, let's scroll down and create some new lines, and we'll create an object. Const object 1 equals
ओके सो होस्टिंग मींस क्या होता है कि अगर हम इस तरीके से करते हैं तो होस्टिंग अगर हम डिक्लेयर करेंगे तो वो काम करेगा
curly brackets. And inside this object, we'll have a property num with the value 2. So this saves the number 2 inside this object. Now, because functions are values, we can also save a function inside this object. So we'll type comma, and then a property fun, colon, and we'll create a function this time. Function, greeting, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside, we'll type console.log, the string hello 3. So this saves a function inside this object under the property fun. Now to access this function, we just use the dot notation as normal. So object 1 dot fun. And because this value is a function, we can call it using brackets. If we save, this will run the code inside the function and display hello 3. So remember, this is called a method when we have a function saved inside an object. Again, as long as there's a way to access this function, for example, using object1.fun, then we don't need this function name. So we'll delete it and use an anonymous function. For example, using object1.fun, then we don't need this function name. So we'll delete it and use an anonymous function. Now let's think, what else can we do with a value? We can pass a value into a function. For example, down here, let's create a function display, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll give this function a parameter. So in here, we'll create a parameter and name it param. And inside the function, we can use a parameter just like a variable. So we'll console.log the param. And then down here, let's call this function using display, brackets, and 2. This will take the value 2, save it inside param, and then we can use it just like a variable. If we save, this will display 2 in the console. So this is known as passing a value into a function. Now, because functions are values, we can also pass a function into a function. So let's give it a try. Down here, we'll create a new function run, brackets, and curly brackets. And this function will also have a parameter. Let's call it param. And down here, we'll call this function run, brackets, and between the brackets, we're going to give it a function this time. So we'll type function, brackets, and curly brackets, and inside the function, we'll type console.log the string hello4. So this will take this function and save it inside param. And now up here, we can use param just like a variable. So we can type param, and because param contains a function, we can actually just call it using brackets. If we say
अबे यार ये क्या बोल दिया? नहीं तो लिख कर रहा हूँ. ठीक है, सॉरी.
save, this code will run the function that we created down here and display hello4. So this is called passing a function into another function. The function that we're passing in is called a callback function or a callback. So to summarize, functions are values. Anything we can do with a value, we can also do with a function. Now let's do some practical examples using functions as values. We're going to learn a feature of JavaScript called setTimeout. SetTimeout allows us to run a function in the future. First, we'll comment out the previous code. Using /* and at the bottom */. And let's create some new lines. And we're going to type the code set capital T timeout. So setTimeout is a built-in function. So we can type brackets to call this function. Now setTimeout takes 2 parameters. Inside these brackets, the first parameter is a function that we want to run in the future. Let's create a function, brackets and curly brackets. And inside this function, let's type console.log the string timeout. So here we're using a function as a value and we're passing it into another function. At the end, we'll type a comma and we'll give setTimeout a second parameter. The second parameter is how long to wait before running this function. So this is a number in milliseconds. 1000 milliseconds is equal to 1 second. So if we type 3000 milliseconds, this is equal to 3 seconds. So setTimeout will wait for 3 seconds and then call this function. If we save, after 3 seconds, it's going to display timeout in the console. So that's setTimeout. We give it a function and it will call this function after a certain amount of time.
Want to know why some Python developers make 3x more than others? Regular Python developer 8 LPA, Python plus AI developer 25 LPA.
So now we're going to learn an important concept called asynchronous code. So after setTimeout, let's type console.log the string next line and save. So notice that it displays next line first, and then after 3 seconds, it displays timeout. So what's happening here? Why are they reversed? setTimeout sets up a timer, and after 3 seconds, it will call this function. However, it doesn't actually wait for the 3 seconds to finish. It just sets up the timer and immediately goes to the next line. So that's why this line is displayed first. So this is called asynchronous code. Asynchronous code means the computer won't wait for this line to finish before going on to the next line. So for setTimeout, it'll just set up the timer and then immediately go to the next line. Synchronous code, on the other hand, means the computer will wait for one line to finish before going to the next line. So all the code we've written in this course so far has been synchronous code. In addition, all the code inside this function is also synchronous code. So if we added console.log the string timeout2 and save, the code inside the function will still run line by line. It will wait for each line to finish before going to the next line. And after 3 seconds, it will display timeout followed by timeout2. So don't worry, all the code that we normally write will be synchronous code. It will run line by line as usual. The only time that code becomes asynchronous is when we use certain features of JavaScript, like setTimeout. So setTimeout is the only part that is asynchronous. Now, the advantage of setTimeout being asynchronous is that it doesn't block our code for 3 seconds, waiting for this timer to finish. It just sets up the timer in the background and then goes to the next line of code. So this allows our code to do other things while this timer is running in the background. And this is similar to real life. If you set up a timer on your alarm clock, you're not going to stop and wait for the timer to finish. You're going to go and do something else. Asynchronous code is the exact same concept. Next, we're going to learn a similar function to setTimeout called setInterval. So at the bottom, let's type the code set capital interval, and set interval is another built-in function, so we can call it using brackets. And set interval takes the same two parameters as set timeout. The first parameter is a function that we want to run in the future. So let's type function, brackets, and curly brackets, and inside we'll type console.log.
confusing हो रहा है. एक सेकंड.
The string interval. Now let's add a comma, and the second parameter is also a number in milliseconds. So we'll type 3000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. So set interval will run this function 3 seconds in the future, but this time it will keep running the function every 3 seconds. If we save in the console, every 3 seconds it will run the function and display interval. So set interval is also asynchronous. Below it, if we type console.log, the string next line 2, and save, it will set up the interval and then immediately go to the next line and display next line 2. So that's set interval. We give it a function and it will keep running this function after a certain period of time. So now let's do a project using what we learned so far. Let's go to our browser and we'll create a new tab at the top. And here, let's type supersimple.dev/projects/advanced-functions and press enter. So this is basically the rock, paper, scissors game that we created earlier, except this time it has an extra button called autoplay. If we click this button, every second the computer will play by itself. So this feature will help us practice using set interval. So first, let's make a copy of the project files. We'll go into our code editor and click this icon to show our files. And let's make a copy of 10 rock, paper, scissors for this lesson. So we'll right-click, copy, and down here, right-click and paste. And I'll stop this for now. So here, we're going to change the name by right-clicking, rename. We'll remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, we'll change it to 12 and press enter. And let's also make a copy of the JavaScript and CSS files. So we'll click this file and right-click, copy, and then click the folder, right-click, paste, and we'll rename this file. Right-click, rename, remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, change it to 12 and press enter. And let's also make a copy of the CSS file. Select it, right-click, copy, click the folder, right-click and paste. And right-click, rename, remove copy, and at the front, change it to 12 and press enter. Now let's scroll down to 12 rock, paper, scissors. And I'll close this for now. And inside the head, let's change this to load 12 rock, paper, scissors. And we'll scroll to the bottom. And here, instead of the lesson 10 file, we'll load the lesson 12 JavaScript file. Let's save, and we'll open this in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. So now we're ready to begin. Let's go back to supersimple.dev. And the first thing we're going to create is this autoplay button. So beside the reset score button, which is here, we're going to create a new button, less than, button, greater than, and inside we'll have the text autoplay. Let's save and go back to our tab. And now we have this button. So next, let's style this button with CSS. So we'll give it a class equals auto-play-button, and save. And now let's open the CSS file. I'm going to take this file and then drag it to the bottom so I can see it side by side. So I'll close this for now and rearrange this a little bit. And then down here, and we're going to style the autoplay button. So let's just make the style the same as the reset score button. So in the CSS, we'll scroll down to the reset score button styles. So we'll add a comma at the end and type auto-play-button. So now these styles will apply to the class reset score button and the autoplay button. If we save, now we styled our project. So next, let's make this button interactive. So at the top here, we'll add an on-click attribute. And then in here, we're going to run some JavaScript code. Let's actually create a function so we can separate the JavaScript into its own file. So we'll run a function called autoplay and brackets. So now let's save. And right now, this function doesn't exist. So we have to create this function in the JavaScript file. So for me, the file's right here. I'll select it and then drag it down here so I can see it side by side. So let's scroll down. And I'm going to create it just above the play game function. So here, we'll create some new lines and type function autoplay, brackets and curly brackets. And now inside this function, we want to play the game every second. So we can use set interval to run some code every second. So let's type set interval brackets, and inside the brackets, we'll give it a function that we want to run. So brackets and curly brackets. And then at the end, let's type a comma, and we'll give it 1000. So this means it will run this function every 1000 milliseconds, or 1 second. And now inside this function, we're going to automatically play the game. And to play the game, we can use this function right here, play game. So here, we'll type play game brackets. Now we need to provide this function with a player move. And remember, we have another function, pick computer move, which will give us a random move. So above this line, let's create a variable const player move, and we'll make it equal, and we'll pick a random move using pick computer move and brackets. And finally, we'll take this move that we picked and pass it into this function. So player move. So now when we click this button, it should play the game every second. Let's save and click autoplay, and it works. The computer is playing against itself every second.
You might think this is just another student, one among many at business school, or maybe it's engineering school, just another number in the admissions registry. But she's more than that. She carries her own dreams.
So now let's make this button stop playing when we click it again. So at the top, let's create a variable to keep track of whether or not we're playing. So we'll use let is auto playing, and at the start, we'll make it equal to false, and save. And now inside this function, we'll check using an if statement, brackets and curly brackets. And inside this condition, let's check if we're not playing. So not is auto playing. So if we're not playing, then we want to start playing the game, which is this code down here. So let's select this code, and then right click, cut, and in here, right click and paste. And also, after we start playing the game, we're going to change this variable to true. So is auto playing, and we'll make it equal to true, because now we are auto playing. So now let's add the else branch to this statement. Else, curly brackets. So now we need to stop this interval. So how do we do that? The answer is that set interval actually returns a number, and this number is like an ID. We can use this ID to stop the interval. So at the front, let's create a variable to save this ID. Const interval ID and equals. However, there's another problem here. Every time we run the function, we're going to get a different ID. So in order to save the ID from last time, we need to put this variable outside the function. So let's select this and remove it for now, and we'll scroll up, and here we'll create the variable let interval ID, and we'll leave it undefined to start. And now down here, we're going to save the return value into this variable by typing interval ID equals set interval. And now at the bottom, we're going to use the interval ID to stop the interval. Let's scroll down, and to stop an interval, we can use a function called clear interval. So we'll type clear, capital I, interval, and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to give it an ID that we want to stop. So we'll give it this interval ID, interval ID. And then at the bottom, let's also change is auto playing to false, because we just stopped it. So is auto playing equals false, and save. So now if we try out this button, it will start playing the game by itself every second, and if we click the button again, it will stop playing the game. So that's how we stop an interval. We need to save the ID, and then call clear interval with this ID. So now I'll clean up the code a little by removing this extra line, and save. And now we're finished with this feature. So next, let's go back to our advanced functions file. So I'll click up here. And save. I'll add interval ID, and we'll leave it undefined. From last time, we need to put this variable outside the function. So let's select a different ID. So at the front, let's create a variable to save this ID, this interval. So how do we do that? The answer is that setInterval actually returns a number, and this number is like an ID. We can use this ID to stop the interval. So at the front, let's create a variable to save this ID, const interval ID, and equals. However, there's another problem here. Every time we run the function, we're going to get a different ID. So in order to save the ID from last time, we need to put this variable outside the function. So let's select this and remove it for now. And we'll scroll up. And here, we'll create the variable let interval ID. And we'll leave it undefined to start. And now down here, we're going to save the return value into this variable by typing interval ID equals set interval. And now at the bottom, we're going to use the interval ID to stop the interval. Let's go down. And to stop an interval, we can use a function called clear interval. So we'll type ID. And then at the bottom, let's also change is auto playing to false because we just stopped it. So is auto playing equals false and save. So now if we try out this button, it will start playing the game by itself every second. And if we click the button again, it will stop playing the game. So that's how we stop an interval. We need to save the ID and then call clear interval with this ID. So now I'll clean up the code a little by removing this extra line and save. And now we're finished with this feature. So next, let's go back to our advanced functions file. So I'll click up here, and then at the bottom, I'll open 12 advanced functions and hide the files for now. And we're going to learn some more features of functions as values. So let's actually close the other files that we opened. And first, let's comment out the previous code with /* and at the bottom, */. Let's go down and save, and let's open the tab for this file. So now we're going to learn another way to loop through an array. First, let's create an array. We'll type square brackets, and inside the array, we'll have the string make dinner, and another string wash dishes, and another string watch YouTube. So in the previous lesson, we learned how to loop through an array using a for loop or a while loop. Another way to loop through an array is using a method of the array called for each. So at the bottom, let's type dot for capital E each, and brackets. So this is the for each method, and it allows us to loop through this array. Inside these brackets, we're going to give for each a function. So we'll type function, brackets, and curly brackets. So again, we're just passing a function into another function. However, this function will be a little different. We're going to give it a parameter. So up here, let's create a parameter called value. So what for each does is that it loops through the array, and for each of these values, it will save the value in the parameter and run the function. So let's console.log value. And save. So this will loop through the array and display each value in the console. So let's go through this step by step. So it'll take the first value, save it in this parameter, and run the function. Then it will take the second value, save it in the parameter, and run the function. Then it will take the third value, save it in the parameter, and run the function. So the for each method is actually the preferred way to loop through an array, because this is easier to read than a for loop like this. And for each also has another feature. We can give this function a second parameter. So we can type comma, and the second parameter is the index, or the position of the value in the array. So for the first value, index will be 0. For the second value, index will be 1. Third value, index will be 2, and so on. So above this line, let's also console.log the index and save. And this will also display the index of each value. All right, now let's do a practical example using the for each method. We're going to go back to the to-do list project that we created in the previous lesson. So we'll click up here to show our files, and let's scroll up, and let's open 11todolist.js. So in this code, we used a for loop to display the to-do list on the page. We're going to switch this to using a for each method instead. So first, let's actually make a copy of the files for this project. We'll click up here, and let's click 11 to-do list, and right-click, copy, and let's click the script folder, right-click, and paste. And now we'll rename this by right-clicking, rename, remove copy from the end, and change the beginning to 12, and press enter. Let's also make a copy of the CSS and HTML file for this project. So we'll click the CSS file, right-click, copy, click the styles folder, right-click, and paste. Right-click, rename, remove copy, and at the front, change it to 12, and press enter. And finally, we'll scroll down, click 11todolist.html, right-click, copy, and then down here, right-click, and paste. Right-click, rename, remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, change it to 12, and press enter. Now we can hide these files, and we can close the lesson 11 files. And now here, we're going to change the CSS file that we load to 12 to-do list. And we'll scroll down, and we'll also change the JavaScript file that we load to 12 to-do list. Now let's save, and we'll open this in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. Okay, now let's go back to the JS file. So I'll take this file and drag it to the bottom, and I'll rearrange the windows here. And we're going to scroll down, and we'll change this for loop to use a for each method. So first, let's type above this for loop, and we'll type the array that we want to loop through, which is to-do list. And we'll type dot and use the for each method and brackets. Inside the brackets, we'll give it a function that we want to run for each to-do. So we'll type function, brackets, and curly brackets. And this function can have two parameters. The first parameter will contain each value in the array. So we'll call it to-do object. We'll type a comma, and the second parameter contains each index in the array. So we'll just call it index. And now inside this loop, we basically want to do everything that we did here. So let's just make a copy of this code, right-click, copy, and then up here, inside for each, right-click, and paste. So now if we scroll up, we already have the to-do object up here. So we don't need to get it from the array like before. So we can remove this line. And let's also remove these comments. The other thing we have to change is that previously we were using I for the index, but now the index is called index. So we'll just change this to index. So that's how we use a for each method instead of a for loop. If we compare this code to the for loop that we had before, the for each method is easier to read. So for the rest of this course, we're going to prefer to use for each instead of a for loop. So we're going to remove this for loop. So for the rest of this course, we're going to prefer to use for each instead of a for loop. So we're going to remove this for loop. Let's go back up and save, and the project still works. So that's a practical example of using the for each method. Now let's go back and learn some more details about for each. We'll close the JavaScript file for now and go back to advancedfunctions.html and open the tab for this file. So in the previous lesson, we learned a feature of loops called continue. Continue lets us skip to the next iteration or the next run of the loop. For each methods don't have continue, but we can do the same thing with a return statement. So let's say in this loop, we don't like washing dishes. If the value is wash dishes, we're going to skip it and not display it in the console. So above, we'll create an if statement. And then inside the condition, we'll check if value is equal to the string wash dishes. And then in the curly brackets, if it is equal, we'll return and semicolon. So this return statement will end this function early, and it will go on to the next function. So it basically does the same thing as continue in a for loop. If we save, you'll notice that it skipped wash dishes. In the previous lesson, we also learned a feature of loops called break. Break lets us exit a loop. Loop early. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way to break in a for each loop. So if we need to use break to exit this loop early, then it's better to use a regular for loop.
Hi, Jimmy Pays here with Bitrix 24, a free CRM that will...
Let's take a break before continuing with the rest of this lesson. Here are some exercises that will help you practice what we learned so far.